All right, thank you, folks. Our next speaker is Ashley Dumas, who is Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of West Alabama. She will be presenting her talk today, This Distant and Isolated Post, the Role of Fort Tombecbee in La Louisiane in 1736 to 1763.
Good morning. When I saw the program, I tried to ignore the fact that I might be realizing my worst nightmare in front of 120 people, which is to follow Catherine Brond. But she and Craig and Ned have done a good job of setting up the outlines of a puzzle, that is the history of La Louisiane, and providing you some details, which you may hear again in my presentation, but I hope to fill in a few more pieces of that puzzle for you. And also, my suspicion was confirmed during Catherine's presentation that I really should have typed this up. So I'm going to wing it. In about 1758, Commandant Caleric at Fort Tombecbee was writing a letter and complaining to the governor of Louisiana that the fort was falling apart, that morale was low, supplies were diminished, and the post of the palisade wall itself, which was the only thing separating them from the outside world, were rotting. The barracks were in bad condition. They could barely use the bake oven. And he said that this was due to the difficulty of moving men and materials 250 miles upriver from Mobile to this distant and isolated post. Fort Tombecbee today is in fact still distant and isolated in some respects. It is in western Sumter County, about 10 miles from the town of Livingston. If any of you are familiar with that area, it's in Epps. Today, if you went to the site of the fort, you would see this granite monument, and this is what most people sort of associate with Fort Tombecbee today. This is a monument erected in 1915 by the Colonial Dames of America, who owned the site at the time. But I'd like to zoom in on one portion of that monument, and I'll just read it to you in case you can't read it. 1736, on this site stood Fort Tombecbee, built by Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne, Sieur de Bienville, governor of Louisiana. Here, civilization and savagery met the wilderness, and the wilderness beheld the glory of France. It is a monument of its time. It is certainly a romantic story, a romantic version of history. And in some ways, I feel that it has never quite been corrected. There is a wonderful manuscript written by historian Jim Pate, dating to 1980. It remains unpublished. There were excavations at the fort in 1980. The manuscript and the excavations were both sponsored by the Alabama Historical Commission. And until I arrived at the University of West Alabama, nothing else had really been done on Fort Tombecbee. In fact, and I will admonish my previous speakers, our previous speakers just a bit, it is often left off of maps. Put it on your maps. You'll see that I've had to add it to a number of previously published maps. And in fact, in a recently edited memoir of a man who was at Fort Tombecbee, the editors put in a footnote that, alas, Fort Tombecbee long ago eroded into the river, which is just not the case. So I want to correct a little bit of that today. My primary purpose is just to introduce you to Fort Tombecbee and to give you a general overview of its story. And I'm passionate. I'm so passionate about correcting this that I will talk to just about anybody about the history of the fort. So now we have to be on good terms now because you all have blackmail material. But Fort Tom Beckby was a part of, was a tiny part of New France. This is a map of New France as it was in about 1750, and it is a vast territory. If you look at the size of the English holdings, much smaller geographically, but much more densely populated, with a number of very large cities. New France stretched from Quebec to New Orleans, La Nouvelle-Orléans. If you were to drive that, you'd be driving more than 1,800 miles. River miles, which is the primary mode of transportation, it would be much more than that. So this was a difficult area to control. Most of the little dots on the map that you see there are forts that were garrisoned by no more than about 40 men. Okay. The entire population of much of New France would have been about 60,000 people. Okay. 20 times fewer than what was in the English colonies at the time. For this reason, it was critical that the French maintained their alliances with the Native Americans who lived there, who considered themselves to be the owners of the land and who knew it very well. The French tended to be quite good at diplomacy. They did learn to send young boys, as I think Craig mentioned, enfants de langue, into villages to learn the language and the culture, and then bring them back. And these boys would grow up to be diplomats and emissaries between the French and their neighbors. Jesuit missionaries were quite proficient at moving into small but key villages in the area and making friends and learning languages. And the longtime governor of La Louisiane, the lower portion of New France, was Bienville, who himself turned out to be not always successful, but a fairly good diplomat as well. This is one of my favorite maps. This is the 1733 map by Baron de Crenay. It's a well-studied map. I've heard Craig give a great speech on this map. So this is the entire map, and I wanted to show you this even though you can't see it in a lot of detail, because what we put on maps really is the same as what we might put in any document, right? It reflects an agenda. So this isn't so much about, or is as much about who is on the map as it is about geographical accuracy. This is a map that was made to indicate the relationship of the French settlements with the placement of Native Americans. The smaller red areas you see here are Native American settlements. The number of little huts you see represent the number of warriors or potential combatants or allies. You also note that they went to great lengths in documenting trails, lines of communication as well. So why Fort Tom Beckby? It started in 1729. If you look at this, where's our pointer here? This little fort here called Fort Rosalie in present-day Natchez, Mississippi. Fort Rosalie had been a pretty prosperous little fort. There were a number of French families living there. There were close to 350 French settled there, but they were the soldiers in the fort were led by a particularly onerous commandant who took it upon himself to be one of the first people to simply go out and claim that he could take land from his Natchez neighbors. He was belligerent, and the Natchez finally had enough. They decided one day that they would simply take out the entire problem. There were one day in 1729, 230 Frenchmen killed. Most of the women and children were taken as, and the African slaves there were taken as slaves or were traded out. The Natchez scattered. And for a number of years after this attack at Fort Rosalie, there was sort of a guerrilla warfare played out on this part of the frontier in this part of La Louisiane. French would send out native allies, or themselves would accompany native allies and track down Natchez warriors or any Natchez they could find and murder them. They actually had the governor at the time ordered that an entire village of unrelated Indians be massacred and burned to the ground to set an example. And finally, Bienville realized that to keep this under control so that other nations would not be inspired to do the same thing against the French, that he really needed to settle the score with the Natchez Indians. In the meantime, most of the Natchez had taken refuge among the Chickasaws. The Chickasaws were staunch allies of the British, who by now in this symposium you should know were also the mortal enemy of the French. So here you have the Natchez moving to the Chickasaws, who are well supplied and well armed by the English. You have much of this territory disputed as to whether it is British or French territory. And so Bienville decided that they needed to launch a planned, coordinated, large-scale military attack on the Chickasaws. This would send a message that you should not harbor enemies of the French, and it would also send a strong message to the British that they were not going to put up with anyone who tried to interfere with their aims in La Louisiane. So Bienville coordinated with one of the leaders of the Illinois country, d'Artaguiette. They planned to rendezvous in April or early May, just outside the Chickasaw villages. So you had a company coming down from the Illinois, you had a company coming upriver from Mobile. Bienville needed to gather his troops, and so they set up a camp on a high bluff on the Tombigbee River, known to the Choctaws as Itatom-Igabe. That should sound a little bit like the root for Tombigbee, because it is. At the creek of Itatom-Igabe, they established a camp. A fort had been under construction, but it wasn't nearly ready. The trouble with this whole plan getting underway were twofold. One, Bienville was late. He was late because of the spring rains, and he had a lot of trouble getting up the river with 50 flatboats and canoes loaded with supplies and around 600 militia and French Marines. The other problem is that when they got there, unlike what this rather crude drawing shows, these are bread ovens. And by the time Bienville got there, he was very dismayed, and makes quite a point of it in his records of this event that there was only one bread oven constructed. And the reason for that is that this is chalk subsoil. It's quite distinctive, right? This is what underlies the Black Belt physiographic district of the center of Alabama. Chalk, though abundant, does not make a great building material. It expands and it contracts with water and heat. It fractures, and so here are the French trying to make a bread oven out of chalk, and it was a mess. Why is this such a big deal? Well, an army marches on its stomach. You can't have 600 men foraging through the forest on their way up the river for battle. They needed bread to supply them in this expedition. So they were delayed by rains. They were delayed by the preparation of the bread ovens. In the meantime, the Choctaw allies located nearest, just about 30 miles away in sort of present-day eastern Mississippi, were slowly arriving. They were led by primarily Red Shoes and Alabama Mingo, and they brought around 600 Choctaw warriors. There was also a company of 45 free Africans led by a man named Simon, whom I'd love to know more about. So you have a force of around 1,200. After they're ready, they leave Fort Tombigbee. They go up the Tombigbee River near present-day Tupelo, and they find that D'Artaguiet had already come and had been defeated. D'Artaguiet arrived on time. He didn't realize until it was too late that Bienville was late. And he had a choice. He could attack, or he could wait out Bienville. The problem was his supplies were running low. So he decided they were there, they'd come all the way down from Illinois country, so they would launch an attack on the Chickasaws. They were defeated badly, and they were pursued. D'Artaguiet himself was mortally wounded in this conflict. So when Bienville arrived, nearly a month later, he had no help. There were no reinforcements. This is known as the Battle of Aquia. The site of Aquia has recently been confirmed through archaeology as being in a subdivision of southern Tupelo. This is a wonderful map. Basically, this is the French approach to the battle, and this is a hilltop. So there were 3 separate villages, and they united and sort of concentrated themselves on this hilltop. And then they fortified their cabins. And they fortified their cabins, some of them with earth and walls, very suspiciously in the style of a European defensive fort. And the French didn't really expect that. But the Chickasaws were aided by the British. And they had not only British advice on how to defend against the French attackers, which they obviously knew were coming, they also had plenty of muskets and ammunition. This story did not end well. It was disastrous. There were a number of officers killed, including Joseph de Lucé, who had been really the builder of Fort Tom Beckby and its first commandant. The French, including Governor Bienville himself, really had to limp their way back to Tom Beckby downriver because by this time, just a month later, the river was low. And they had to pull their boats back downstream. Remember, this is pre-lock and dam impoundment of rivers, right? It's unpredictable. It can flood. It can drain quite unpredictably, quite suddenly. The French decided, nevertheless, that they would maintain Tom Beckby. This is a map of the completed fort almost exactly a year after the Battle of Aquia. This dates to March 1737. I suspect that this is a very clean view of the fort. To give you an idea of the scale, first of all, north is to your right on this map. That southern boundary along that creek, that steep ravine, that's about 300 feet. This portion is about 175 feet. It's a pretty spacious fort. I think compared to Fort Toulouse, the buildings were actually spread out a bit farther. It had a bit more breathing room. You have here noted the bakery. Now you have one oven, quite expanded and protected from the elements. Interpreter's hut, magazine or storehouse. This is a 20 by 80 foot building. This is the enlisted men's barracks. Officer's kitchen, officer's quarters, prison and guardhouse, powder magazine, and a little guardhouse there. What they don't show on here are latrines, numerous sheds, stables. Oops. There were stables. We know from later accounts that the officers maintained a pigeonniere or a pigeon house for their own use. It was never really occupied by more than around 30 to 40 French Marines. The largest percentage of people occupying the fort would have been French Marines. The second largest group of people were Swiss mercenaries. At the very beginning, there were 30 Marines and 20 Swiss mercenaries. Swiss mercenaries from the very famous Regiment de Carré. The Swiss mercenaries were distinguished by their red wool jackets instead of the traditional blue or white wool jackets, and they were like the MPs. Okay, they would have been the enforcers on the spot. Bienville went on to attempt 2 other expeditions against the Chickasaws, each equally disastrous. But Tom Beckby was maintained as a trading post with the Choctaws, who quickly moved a village to within a musket shot of the fort itself. And it was maintained as a listening post. There were English traders. When we think about this in terms of big maps on a screen, you tend to see hundreds of miles, but there were people everywhere. So in one sense, it is distant and isolated. In the other sense, there were Native Americans everywhere. There were traders of various nationalities everywhere. Communication may have been slower, but it was not impossible. So these types of maps, while beautiful and wonderful for archaeology, can also be a bit misleading in the way that you perceive the past and what was happening there. Fort Tom Beckby was a hardship tour. I don't remember before having read that it was described as a hog pen, but given that that was coming from an Englishman, we'll take it with a grain of salt, I suppose. But it was not a happy place. There's at least 1 mutiny recorded. There were probably more than 20 different commandants. I have a list. I think it's around 26 different commandants. Almost 1 for every year that it was occupied, or 1 for every 2 years that it was occupied. There were frequent desertions. In one account, 2 Marines slipped away, headed to the Chickasaws to seek refuge and to offer their services as spies. They were captured by the Choctaws, brought back to the fort, and then they had their heads bashed in. Now, when you think about this as a place where you're in the middle of the wilderness, there are only 50 of you, and in one report, nearly 6,000 of the Choctaw allies, and thousands of others who are allied with your enemy. Can't you just throw them into jail? Right. No. It was very serious offense to desert the fort. One interesting difference between Tom Beckby and forts such as Rosalie or Toulouse is that there were no French families here, not that I've seen as yet. We do know from historical documents that, and from the archaeological record, that the soldiers at the fort were establishing families with Choctaw women, but their households were located outside the fort, and most of them were required to live in the barracks during their time there, during their what was supposed to be only a 2-year tour. We have wonderful documentary records for Fort Tom Beckby. And although we do have this initial manuscript, most of the manuscript is derived from the Mississippi Provincial Archives. There are a number of archives that we haven't been able to get to. In fact, I have a wonderful friend, a parish priest in Louisiana, who's researching his family. One of his direct ancestors was stationed at Fort Tom Beckby, and he goes to France and does this research and then takes photographs of documents and then shares them with us. So we're looking for ways now to do a better job with understanding, with getting access to the documentary record at Fort Tom Beckby. But our records include not only maps, but we have architectural plans. In fact, I think that some of the buildings at Fort Toulouse are based on the architectural plans from Fort Tom Beckby. Is that correct? Yeah, this is a picture of the enlisted men's barracks, drawn up in 1759. Now, this was a stressful place to be. Like the other outposts in La Louisiane, shipments of trade goods were one of the major sources of consternation for commandants and soldiers who were out in these places, marooned in a sense out in these places. Tom Beckby itself was never a huge player in the deerskin trade. I think Toulouse was only like 6th or something in all of New France, and Tom Beckby ranked below that, so less than 2,500 skins really per year. So it was not a big deal. But when Choctaws did show up with skins, they were frequently turned away. because the French simply didn't have anything to trade with. And that's actually matching up really well with the archaeology. When I first arrived at West Alabama and started looking through the existing collections of the fort, I started thinking, where are all the trade beads? Where are all the trade goods? I mean, I kind of cut my teeth in archaeology at Old Mobile. And there was nothing like what I had expected, and now I know that that really is a true reflection of the situation. This was an impoverished place. It was also sort of a microcosm of the situation that in part led to the Choctaw Civil War. The Western faction of Choctaws, here's Tom Beck V would be about right here. The Western faction of Choctaws was led by Red Shoes, and they were pro-British. Red Shoes himself traveled overland to Charleston and tried to establish direct trading ties. The eastern branch of the Choctaws were staunchly pro-French. In a sense, this isn't surprising, but they were also closer geographically to the French and probably intermarried, right? Probably literally blood related with more Choctaws in the eastern branch. So this led to between about 1746 to 1747 to 1750 a great deal of bloodshed, Choctaws against Choctaws, which Catherine spoke about earlier. And despite the attempts of Debonair Adair, there was a particularly skilled commandant at Fort Tom Beckby during this period of time. His name was Grandpré. He was a particularly astute political diplomat, and he managed to negotiate peace with Red Shoes, and he sort of brokered peace between the eastern and the western factions. This was done at Fort Tom Beckby. Grandpré drafted up the treaty. It was signed at Fort Tom Beckby, and it's known as the Treaty of Grandpré. During the French and Indian War, also as alluded to earlier, much of the fun stuff was happening up in New England during the French and Indian War. These remote outposts were on guard, but in many ways, apart from a few extra skirmishes, perhaps with some Chickasaws, life went on as miserably as it had before. Until the 1763 Treaty of Paris, under which France ceded all of La Louisiane to the English. It was a very peaceful transition at Fort Tom Beckby. The English simply took possession. They made an inventory. They said, hey guys, you mind leaving your cannons here? The French said, we don't need them anymore. And the English renamed it Fort York. During this time, Lieutenant Thomas Ford, who arrived, said, this place is in horrible shape. We've got to rebuild. And we don't have a good account of what they rebuilt, but the archaeology tells us that they did. However, England was on the winning side. They now possessed all of that interior, and Fort Tom Beckby and other small forts like it became unnecessary. Who are they guarding against? The Choctaws are not stupid. They're going to go with the winners in this sense. So there was really no point. They occupied it off and on for about 5 years until 1768 when they finally abandoned it. And in 1772, when British surveyor Bernard Romans came down the Tombigbee River, he looked up at the white chalk bluff and he said, there sits the ruins of old Fort Tom Beckby. Now, it was abandoned and sat there for some 20-odd years, perhaps occupied and scavenged and salvaged and whatnot by traders and others who lived nearby. But in 1794, Spain, who took quite an interest in this area, because Old Fort Tom Beckby was near the northern boundary of what Spain considered to be the northern boundary of West Florida, and they were testing, in a sense, the new nation, who is the major player on the continent now, the United States of America. The Spanish went into this area. They negotiated with the Choctaws a treaty to reoccupy the spot where Fort Tom Beckby had been, and they rebuilt a fort and called it Fort Confederation in honor of that treaty. When you go to Fort Tom Beckby today, what you see are the remains of the Spanish earthworks from 1790. Many people think that's Tom Beckby, but it isn't. That's the Spanish fort. This is just a fancy overlay of the topography of Fort Confederation. You can see the crown shape here, overlaid onto the original French fort. And the reason I want to tell you that is, point this out, is because those earthworks are great. I'm not snubbing a 1790s archaeological site, right, Spanish archaeological site. But if you want to understand what was happening earlier during the French occupation of the fort, you need to know where the ground has not been disturbed. And that is right here, outside the French barracks, outside the Confederation fort, and here. And so we have been doing archaeology there every other year since 2010. We discovered the French palisade wall, that dark stain that you see there. We discovered a corner in the palisade wall, which is critical because once we had the corner, we could link it into other places. You can see repairs in the palisade wall. This was not a paired post palisade. You can actually see 2 rows of posts here where they repaired it. It's filled with a number of wonderful artifacts. And we were able to, from knowing where that palisade corner is, use that very accurate French map and project where other places might be. So then we've also been looking at the French bakery, which would have looked like this but had a more substantial covering over it. I've used University of West Alabama students and volunteers from the Alabama Archaeological Society to uncover things like this. Right? Archaeologists look at that and say, ooh, okay, trust me. We've been able to find evidence of English reoccupation and rebuilding right on top of the earlier French remains, which is wonderful. And here's another thing that we've done, which some people might say we're crazy for, but it's paid off. Every bucket of dirt that we excavate from this site is screened through window screen. It takes me about 2 years to process one field school. But it's been worth it because it's through that effort that we find things like trade beads, scarce as they are, and brass stick pins and egglets and other personal items. We've also excavated at the barracks, found remarkable features of construction. We're learning a lot about how Tom Beckby was built and maintained over the years. And I'm running out of time, that's why I'm skipping through these like the way you walk through a museum exhibit, right? Okay. Okay. Objects that identify the relationship between the Choctaws and the French, and I should note that the most common type of artifact that we find at Tom Beckby, apart from animal bones, is Choctaw pottery inside the fort. We have a lot of fun, and we recently implemented part of a grant from the Alabama Historical Commission to put up interpretive signs. This site is not open to the public, but if any of you ever want to go there, just give me a call or send me an email. I'll be happy to go out there. And I don't even have to be there now because we have interpretive signs. The fort is eroding into the river. So we do crazy things like this. We did this 2 weeks ago. Our museum director rappelled off the side of the 60-foot cliff, and we built a large chute out of a billboard tarp and began chopping away at portions that were eroding. So, thank you very much.